Eastern Idaho, 1832. As bullets whiz by them and the sounds of gunshots fill the air, a group of Blackfoot warriors urge their galloping horses towards a small lake ensconced in the mountainous terrain. Behind them, in hot pursuit, ride several American fur trappers, firing their single-shot rifles and pistols to the best of their abilities while riding atop their galloping mounts. With little option in the way of escape, the small group of Blackfoot warriors take to the frigid waters of the small lake. Here, with their horses in water up to their withers, the warriors now launch arrows towards their attackers. The fur trappers in hot pursuit are momentarily stalled, not wanting to risk bogging their horses down in the water by furthering their attack. They retreat to a position on the banks of the small body of water under cover of the area's abundant timber. From here, they trade shots with the waterlogged Blackfoot, assuming their quarry to be trapped and all but assuredly doomed. But this Blackfoot hunting party the trappers have happened upon are in fact only one small part of a larger band of Blackfoot camped only a few miles away. When one warrior on a particularly fleet pony makes his way back to their village, reinforcements are quickly gathered, and in mere minutes, a force of hundreds of Blackfoot warriors are mounted and charging out of the camp towards their brethren who are trapped in the waters of the lake. Soon, it is the American fur trappers who are on the defensive, as the newly arrived Blackfoot reinforcements pour over the hilltop behind them. At the head of the attack is a Blackfoot chief named Eagle Ribs. He is a member of the Buffalo Society and among the very few warriors allowed to wear the horns of the buffalo as a headdress. He rides in front of his warriors, all among them incensed at the trappers' attack. In the preceding few months, the Blackfoot had killed numerous fur trappers in the area, along the Yellowstone and Gallatin rivers. They are, without question, the most feared tribe among the trappers here on the northern plains. The Blackfoot are a powerful warrior tribe, the ruling power here on the northern plains, a title they have earned through years of ruthless expansion after the introduction of the horse to their people sometime in the 17th century led to a veritable explosion in capabilities in both hunting and raiding. Now, as they turn the tide of the trappers' attack, a shudder flows down the spines of the once bellicose mountain men, as all among them know that, while being killed by the Blackfoot will surely be a terrifying end, it will pale in comparison to the agonies that await them should they be taken alive. Now, under a hail of arrows and bullets, the trappers are forced to retreat from their position, abandoning their attack and riding back towards their own camp, several miles away. Just minutes prior to their arrival, the camp had been a typical scene of activities, with men carrying out chores, repairing equipment, and checking their inventories. But as the first riders fleeing the Blackfoot race into camp, the routine of the morning is quickly broken, and it is readily apparent to the trappers that they will now have to take immediate action in a fight for their lives. Now, the men amongst the trappers' forces will soon face the full might of the Blackfoot's martial prowess brought to bear on them here in the middle of the wilds of the Idaho mountains. Among the trappers is 28-year-old Jim Bridger, one of the most experienced among them, and for all intents and purposes, their elected leader. Bridger has seen more of the American West than most living men. Born James Felix Bridger in Richmond, Virginia in 1804, Bridger had come west like so many countless other American young men in the early 19th century, in search of adventure and fortune. As a teenage neophyte to the frontier, on his first trapping expedition, Bridger had been part of the seminal Ashley's 100 fur trapping expedition that set out from St. Louis in 1823. While on this initial foray into the world of the mountain men, Bridger had been one of the 2 men charged with remaining with Hugh Glass after his now infamous misfortune of being severely mauled by a mother grizzly in present-day South Dakota. Glass, a legendary trapper in his own right, and already a noted veteran by the time Jim Bridger arrived on the frontier, had been so badly wounded that his comrades, unable and unwilling to linger in a dangerous hostile native territory for what they saw as an exercise in futility, had left Bridger and another trapper named John Fitzgerald to remain with Glass until he inevitably expired from his wounds. But as Bridger and Fitzgerald fretfully waited hour after hour in the frigid, dangerous territory for their comrade to finally succumb to his condition, he proved amazingly and frustratingly resilient. Though he appeared to continue to decline, Glass simply refused to die. After their nerves had been sufficiently rattled by the prospect of being captured alive by hostile natives, they had weighed their options and chose, regrettably, to leave Glass to his seemingly inevitable fate. They had eventually made their way back to civilization, where the young Bridger had joined up with another fur company, and Fitzgerald had gone on to join the army. But Hugh Glass did not die. Instead, in a feat that is now etched in the annals of frontier legend, he managed to survive and effectively drag himself hundreds of miles to the nearest fort, where his wounds were treated and his life miraculously saved. Once recovered, Glass had eventually sought revenge on Bridger and Fitzgerald, but found Fitzgerald now under the protection of the U.S. Army, and Bridger to be just a teenage boy. He ultimately forgave the youngster and Fitzgerald out of the charity of his own heart. Despite this relatively inauspicious start, Bridger would remain undaunted in his pursuit of life as a mountain man. In the fall of 1824, he would become one of the first white men to explore the Yellowstone region of present-day northwestern Wyoming. Here, he was one of the first Americans to lay eyes on the parting of the waters at Yellowstone Lake. In 1830, he was part of a group that bought out the legendary Jedediah Smith's stake in what would come to be known as the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a trapping outfit composed of several members of Ashley's 100 who sought to contest the powerful John Jacob Astor's monopolist American Fur Company. By 1834, however, with the decline of the beaver population and growing difficulty in turning a profit in the fur trade, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company was bought out by the American Fur Company and absorbed into Astor's corporate structure. In 1835, Bridger had married a woman named Emma from the Flathead tribe, a people who resided in the ranges of what is today western Montana and eastern Idaho. The couple would ultimately have 3 children together, necessitating, or perhaps excusing, Bridger's constant excursions with fur trapping companies into increasingly less profitable and increasingly dangerous territories. In this year of 1836, Bridger and his troop of fur trappers are on their way to the yearly rendezvous that will be held in present-day Idaho at a place called Pierre's Hole. The rendezvous is an annual tradition amongst the mountain men and local tribes, one that affords all a brief, fleeting respite from the drudgeries and dangers of life on the frontier. The furs and hides that had been so arduously gotten in the preceding year would be traded and sold. Goods and supplies would be bought and bartered for, and all could partake in the ample good food and drink. Songs, dances, gambling, gossip, as well as romantic liaisons between lonely mountain men and native women, all abounded. Though not the debauched and overtly drunken scene that is often portrayed, the yearly rendezvous was a lively and exciting affair. Bridger, as well as the rest of the mountain men in camp, had long looked forward to the affair, and now, with the rendezvous only days away, it had briefly seemed to all that they could almost taste the flowing hard cider and freshly baked breads. However, now, any thoughts of rest and recreation are quickly dashed as the influx of their comrades riding at full speed pours into the camp. The cry of "Blackfoot" quickly spreads throughout the camp, and now Jim Bridger and the rest of the trappers scramble to their single-shot rifles and make ready for the fight to come. The trappers take their positions in a loose battle line facing the direction of the approaching Blackfoot, and, for a few eerie moments, they can only hear the thundering hooves and war whoops of the warriors rapidly closing in to make their attack. Then, suddenly, the war party crests the top of the hill overlooking the campsite. Seeing the defensive line of mountain men protecting the camp, the Blackfoot pause atop the hill, just outside of rifle range. For a harrowing few minutes, a nervous tension permeates the air, as both parties warily appraise the size and strength of their opponent's forces. However, as the nervous trappers eye the sizable war party atop the hill in front of them, one amongst their party carefully and excitedly searches the lines of the mounted warriors, hoping to see a familiar face. She is the wife of one of the trappers, a Mexican man named Loretto, who had bartered for her freedom a number of years earlier after finding her as a prisoner of the Crow. She is, in fact, a member of the Blackfoot tribe. Though taken from her people as a young woman, she is intimately familiar with Blackfoot culture and customs, and, having not visited this territory for several years, might very possibly be a long-lost relative or friend to the attacking Blackfoot. While she finds no comfort in searching for a familiar face, what happens next brings a brief glimmer of hope to herself and all amongst the trappers. Calmly and coolly from atop the hill, Chief Eagle Ribs now rides forward with a small group of warriors, bearing a pipe of peace and gesturing for the trappers to send a group of their own to discuss peace negotiations. Now, Jim Bridger enlists the help of the Blackfoot woman to act as an interpreter, and Bridger, the woman, and a small group of trappers now make their way towards the expanse between the two lines, all the while wary of a surprise attack from the Blackfoot. As an off-putting silence overtakes the battlefield, it seems to many present that all that can be heard is the plodding of the two parties' horses towards one another. As he rides in front of his group, Bridger begins to scan the line of Blackfoot warriors to the rear of Eagle Ribs and his contingent, growing increasingly concerned as he nears the spot where the proposed negotiations are to take place. In only a precious few seconds, his suspicions overtake him, and as he, the other trappers, and the Blackfoot woman are mere yards away from Chief Eagle Ribs and his men, with the chief now extending his hand in a gesture of peace, Bridger attempts to quietly pull back the hammer on his single-shot rifle. But in the tense silence that has befallen the would-be battlefield, the minute action resounds with a voluminous click, audible to all of those present, especially to Chief Eagle Ribs. The Blackfoot chief instantly grabs the barrel of Bridger's rifle and thrusts it towards the ground. As he does so, Bridger attempts to pull the trigger and shoot the chief, but his bullet merely fires harmlessly into the dirt. Now, a violent struggle ensues between Bridger and Chief Eagle Ribs, and within moments, the entirety of both parties, with the exception of the Blackfoot woman, are in a full-pitched fight. As Bridger and the chief fight from atop their horses, another Blackfoot warrior sends an arrow whipping through the air and slamming into the small of Bridger's back. Moments later, a second arrow strikes just above the first, both projectiles embedding themselves deeply into the unfortunate man's torso. With Bridger now reeling in pain, Eagle Ribs now seizes the rifle from his hands and strikes Bridger from his horse with a powerful blow that Bridger at first assumes to have broken his neck. For her part, the Blackfoot woman takes this opportunity to flee back to the lines of the trappers and her husband and infant child. The Blackfoot warriors, however, quickly thwart her escape, cutting off her path and driving her back towards the Blackfoot. The distressed young mother now becomes irate, screaming inconsolably to be allowed to return to her child. The Blackfoot at first appear unmoved, but after recognizing her as a member of their own people, Chief Eagle Ribs instructs the young woman to call out to her husband and ask him to bring the child to her. He assures her that her husband and child will not be harmed. Minutes later, the nervous young father plods cautiously across the veritable no-man's land that lies between the trappers' lines and the Blackfoot. He assumes that he will likely be killed as soon as he reaches the Blackfoot, but drives himself on in hopes of at least delivering the child to her mother. To his surprise, he arrives at the Blackfoot lines unharmed and is allowed to hand the child over to his wife. However, this is where the charity of Eagle Ribs and his warriors has been exhausted. The man is instructed to now leave his wife and child and return to the trappers. He is promised that he will be left unharmed as he crosses and that his wife and child will be cared for. The unnerved trapper now makes his way, again, across the expanse of mountainous prairie, feverishly wondering if he has seen his young family for the last time. For the time being, it appears that he has, as the Blackfoot now take their newly returned tribal sister and her child with them as they sink over the hills and into the wilderness. The befuddled, heartbroken young father can only watch on. Meanwhile, though the Blackfoot have now left the battlefield, Jim Bridger's troubles have only begun, as the two arrows lodged deeply in his lower back now cause him excruciating pain with even the slightest movement. As his blood-soaked shirt is cut away, it is apparent to his attending brethren that extracting the arrows will be a difficult, painful process. While one of the arrows is pried free with relative ease, the second remains lodged immovably. The arrows employed by this band of Blackfoot are steel-tipped, acquired from trade with the British. Unlike their stone predecessors, these tips do not break or shatter, but bend and hook upon impact, making the extraction of a warped arrowhead all but impossible. After several excruciating attempts, the decision is made that the arrowhead will have to be left. The mountain men present, acting as rudimentary though serviceable physicians considering the circumstances, agree that any further surgical incursion into the wound by their untrained hands will only cause more damage. And so, the bent steel arrowhead is left where it has struck, embedded in the soft tissue of Jim Bridger's lower back. In this pitiable condition, Bridger is now forced to endure the agonizing ride to the rendezvous. The long-awaited trip is all but spoiled for the young mountain man, as his pride is also significantly wounded, having suffered not only the arrow wounds, but the theft of his rifle by the Blackfoot chief Eagle Ribs. Though Bridger is able to turn a substantial profit for his year's worth of trapping, the limitations of his condition only serve to dampen his spirits. But this will not be the last time that the legendary Jim Bridger will meet with the feared and fearsome Blackfoot. Though he will carry the arrowhead in his back for the remainder of his life, Bridger will return to the frontier in only a matter of weeks, and over the course of the succeeding years, he and his trapper cohorts will meet the Blackfoot in countless brutal confrontations in the fight to control the northern plains. But the many stories of the fabled life of Jim Bridger, as well as the countless instances of heroism, ferocity, selflessness, and tragedy that will occur in the battles between the mountain men and the Blackfoot in the years to come, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. August 7th, 1826, at our rendezvous at a place known as the Bend of Bear River, my partners Messrs. Jackson and Sublette and myself came to the conclusion that in order to prosecute our business advantageously, it was necessary that our company should be divided. It was decided that Messrs. Jackson and Sublette would go north on the waters of the Lewis River and the Missouri, and that I should take the remainder of the men and go south. Of the country to the south to southwest we knew comparatively little. Our travels had not extended more than 100 miles to the south and about the same distance to the southwest. What that great and unexplored country might contain, we knew not, but hoped to find parts of the country as well stocked with beaver as some of the waters of the Missouri, which was as much as we could expect reasonably. In taking charge of our southwestern expedition, I followed the bent of my strong inclination to visit this unexplored country and unfold those hidden resources of wealth and bring to light those wonders which I had readily imagined a country so extensive might contain. I must confess that I had at that time a full share of that ambition, and perhaps foolish ambition, which is more or less common to all of the active world. I wanted to be the first to view a country on which the eyes of a white man had never gazed, and to follow the course of rivers that run through a new land. Our arrangements being completed, Messrs. Jackson and Sublette moved on to the north, and I struck to passing the Soda Spring and along the Pumice Stone Valley to a small fork of the Portneuf River. Here, I encamped for the purpose of drying meat, as the buffalo were quite plenty and in fine order. I was well aware that to the south there was little game, and my experience had learned me in many a severe lesson the necessity of providing a supply of provision for traveling in a gameless country. My party consisted of 18 persons beside myself. I remained on Portneuf nearly 3 days, during which the party had dried 3 horse loads of most excellent meat. I then started for Cache, or Willow Valley, to which place I was under the necessity of going to procure some things from our cache and to make some repairs to our guns, for at that place we had a set of blacksmith tools at the crossing of the Bear River. So, making several days at quick traveling, I arrived at the cache on the 15th of August. I found everything safe at the cache, then had some coal burned and a forge erected, and my work was underway as fast as possible. I took such things as I wanted from the cache, and on the 18th of August, I struck over west to the Big Salt Lake, then south, crossing Weber's Fork to the outlet of the Utah Lake, then up to the outlet of the lake. No buffalo ever visit the Utah Lake, but in the vicinity are some elk and deer. On a creek in the vicinity, I found some beaver sign, and nearby, some natives of the Utah Nation. Understanding by them that the principal chief was with his band not far off, I sent a native scout for him. I was anxious to see him, and if possible persuade him to make a treaty with the Snake tribe, for they had been constantly at war. I likewise wished to procure some information as to the country to the south. In the 2 days the native scout returned, but the chief could not be persuaded to come. He was afraid to leave his band on account of the Snake tribe, who he was apprehensive might take the opportunity of his absence to make an attack. He sent word that if beaver hunting was my object, I had better pass his village, as there was a good many beaver a short distance beyond where he then was. This I concluded to do, and after 3 days' travel from the lake, I arrived at his village on the 23rd of August. The country through which we traveled was quite rough and mountainous. I found at that place about 35 lodges of skins and some brush. Each family has 4 or 5 horses. These tribes are constantly moving about, and at this time live almost entirely on service berries which are now ripe. I remained at this place for 2 days, and concluded a treaty with this tribe by which the Americans were allowed to hunt and trap and pass through their country unmolested, and the chief, after much deliberation, declared he would thus go forwards making peace with the Snakes, and that hostilities on his part would cease. I then told him that the Snakes had consented to an armistice until a meeting could be had between the 2 nations, which on my return from the fall hunt I engaged to forward by every means in my power. The Utahs are cleanly, quiet, and active. Their leggings and shirts, which are made of the skins of the deer mountain sheep or the antelope, are kept quite clean. As they sometimes visit the buffalo country, they have robes. Having some communication with the Spanish villages of Taos and Santa Fe, they have more guns than the Snakes. In camp were 2 snake women who had just been taken. One of them was brought by a party who arrived at the same time as mine. She was not more than 13 or 14 years of age. She was obliged to keep sheep with her master every night and carry his pack by day, and as there was no game in the country, she had to dig roots for his food. This barbarous treatment would have passed perhaps unnoticed, for it is not at all uncommon, had it not been for the result which had the effect to fix in my mind. As soon as we reached the village, she was delivered to the squaws in company with one brought in from another direction. I made them a handsome present, as having been directed to do so by General Ashley, who acted in the capacity of a sub-agent. I purchased 3 horses, for which I had paid a high price. Of the country to the south, no satisfactory information could be obtained, but 20 or 30 miles to the east, they told me there were some beaver. I then determined to move east, having been at this place for 2 days. This Utah village moved on in the same direction and encamped with me on the first night. The country was extremely rough, and until ascending a considerable mountain, we kept on the top of a ridge running eastwardly. The next day, I left the Utahs proceeding onwards a few miles and came to a valley and a creek about 20 yards wide running northeast. At that place, we found some beaver, so I remained trapping for 2 or 3 days. At this place, I saw some very old buffalo skulls, and from their appearance, I would suppose that it is many years since the buffalo left this country. Now, they are not found beyond this place. I then moved on south, having a high range of mountains on the west and crossing a good many small streams running east into a large valley, the Valley of the Colorado. But having learned that the valley was very barren and rocky, I did not venture into it. The country here is extremely rough, with little appearance of natives and game quite scarce save for a few mountain sheep and antelope. After traveling in this direction for 2 days, the country looked so unpromising, I determined to strike westward to a low place in the mountains and then cross over. In crossing this mountain, just as we had been encamping, I found an old squaw. There had been several families at this place, but they had run off at our approach. I prevailed on her to come to camp, and one of the men gave her a badger which I supposed she would take home and cook and eat. But the moment it was presented, she caught it in her hands and exclaimed that we were all friends, and immediately tore it into pieces and laid it on the coals. When it was about half cooked, she commenced to eating, making no nice distinction between hair pelts, entrails, and meat. When she had finished her meal, I made her some trifling presents and told her to go and tell her people that we were all friends and that I should be glad to see them. She left us, and in the evening, some men came to the camp. I gave them some presents and by inquiry heard of a river to the west and engaged them as guides. Then, after traveling 3 days from the place where I had turned westward, I came to the river of which the natives had spoken. It was about 60 yards wide with muddy water running northwest. This river I named Ashley's River in compliment to my friend, the enterprising General W.H. Ashley. Here I also found some beaver sign. The inhabitants of this river are the 2 tribes of the Paiute and the Sampach. They appear to subsist entirely on roots. The principal one of these roots is the size of a parsnip, with a leaf somewhat like a beet, and it grows on the richest uplands. They prepare them by laying them on heated stones, and then covering them first with grass and then with earth, where they remain until they are sufficiently steamed. They are then mashed fine and made into small cakes. For their winter provision they are dried. But I had not as good a luck in taking beaver at this place as I had expected from the signs. After remaining a day or two, I moved on 2 short days' travel up the river, nearly directly northwest, to a valley being 6 or 8 miles wide and covered with sedge, but with little grass except along the river. A few antelope, but very wild. It was here that I first saw the black-tailed hare, dark color and not quite as large as the common hare. The natives of this river are not numerous, and may well be called wild, for we seldom get sight of them. They have a peculiar method of conveying intelligence of the approach of danger. Each family or set of families has a quantity of dry sedge bark or brush piled up near the habitation, and immediately on the approach of a stranger, they set fire to the pile, and this being seen by their neighbor, he does the same, and the next the same, so that the alarm flies over the hills in every direction with the greatest rapidity. As soon as they have apprised their neighbor of the approaching danger, they take everything they possess and throw it into a large basket shaped like a sugar loaf and with a strap attached to the top which comes across the forehead, and with the basket on their back, they run to the hills for security. But seeing none of them, and as the beaver were scarce and wild, I determined to move on to the south again. Just above where I left the river, a range of high hills crossed the valley. I ascended a small creek coming in on the west side, and at its head crossed a range of mountains, and 3 days' travel brought me into a low country on the west side of the mountains. Some small streams flowed from the mountain, which I crossed, and seeing that they were all running west, I followed them down, and was not a little surprised to find that they all simply sunk into the sand. As it was useless for me to look for beaver where there was no water, I retraced my steps to where there was water and grass, and encamped. On the following morning, I started early, and as the country looked lowest to the southwest, we moved on in that direction for about 20 miles, and, to my great surprise, instead of a river, an immense sand plain was before me, where the utmost view through my looking-glass could not embrace any appearance of water. The only exception to this interminable wasteland of sand was a few detached rocky hills that rose from the surrounding plain, and the stunted sedge that was thinly scattered over its surface. As it would not be advisable for me to push into a country of this description, I retraced my steps again, and at a late hour at night found water near where I had camped the night before. Several of my horses gave out before encamping, and we left them. The next day, I sent back for the horses that were left, and with the party remaining in the same camp, I started out early on a good horse to take a view of the country traveling south. The range of mountains which I had crossed in coming from the Ashley's River extended south, becoming in that direction somewhat higher. They may be considered the verge of the desert on the east. I went about 15 miles, and from a high hill with my looking-glass could discover trees where I supposed there must be a stream running from the mountains, so I returned to camp. The horses from the day before had been brought in, and throughout the course of this day 2 or 3 antelope had been killed. The next day, we made an early start, and after a long day's travel, we arrived at the place where I had seen the timber. Here, I found a creek 20 yards wide running west with some little beaver sign. The smoke telegraph of the river tribes was seen on the hills during the day as usual. It appeared there were a good many families in this vicinity, but they had fled, not desiring to become acquainted with us. 2 natives had remained behind to gratify their curiosity, trusting their speed perhaps for their safety. But the poor fellows were quickly undeceived when 2 of our men on swift horses pursued them. The probability is they had never seen or heard of horses before, and of course they were much frightened when they saw the men, as it seemed to them that they were sailing on air. They wanted no conversation with us, as personal safety was their only object. They feared that they were about to pay for their curiosity with their lives, but did not attempt to defend themselves, and endeavored to express by a continued jabbering and through signs their desire that my men should go on one way and they would go on the other. Finding it impossible to persuade them to come to camp, I gave them some small presents and then bid them farewell. I trapped on this stream for 2 or 3 days and moved down it some distance. But as there was no beaver and the water began to fail and was apparently soon again lost in the sand, I again ascended to the foot of the mountain and struck south. Chapter 28. The Rendezvous, Arrival of Grand Visitors, Trip to Wind River, and a Fight with the Blackfeet. The season now being far advanced and time for the rendezvous nearly at hand, Jim Bridger and his company left Jackson's Hole and commenced moving toward Green River, trapping as they went. It was during this trip that Rose met with a rather curious adventure and had what might be called a very narrow escape. The ground over which they had been traveling for some days was so stony or gravelly, it was hard on the horses' feet. In fact, some of them became so sore that they could hardly travel, and the trappers were compelled to make moccasins for them out of rawhide. Rose, wishing to make up for lost time, determined to try his luck on a small stream, in which beaver were said to be plenty. But the spot was known to be infested by Blackfeet, and few of the trappers felt inclined to venture out in that direction. As the horse belonging to Rose was too lame to travel, he started an old mule belonging to the company, and Rose says it was one of the most stubborn brutes he ever saw. No amount of coaxing, whipping, or spurring would induce it to get out of a walk. In fact, when he felt the spur touch his flanks, he would stop at once and commence biting at the rider's feet. But as the mule's hooves were sound, Rose concluded that anything would be better than walking. He felt convinced, however, that if chased by the Blackfeet, he should be compelled to leave the mule and trust his own legs for safety. About 5 miles from camp, he shot a deer, and, taking from it the fat ribs, he cooked enough to do him for a day or two, taking the balance along in case he should need it. A little after nightfall, he reached his destination, and as beaver signs were good, he at once set up his traps. He hung his venison on a bush, tethered his mule, and rolled himself into blankets, then laid down in the bushes and went to sleep. How long he slept, he didn't know. He was suddenly awakened by the snorting of the mule, and, springing to his feet, rifle in hand, he saw a large grizzly bear walking off with his venison. Cocking his rifle, he was about to fire, when Caleb, the trapper's colloquial name for the grizzly bear, disappeared into the bushes. It being too dark to follow the monster, Rose again laid down, and slept until near daylight. Then, taking up his traps, he discovered he had caught 4 good beaver. While engaged in skinning them, he fancied he smelt smoke and a fire, and, hurrying up the skinning process, he packed his traps and, mounting his mule, rode out of the bushes to a small hill close by. From the top of this, he was horrified to perceive a camp of nearly 200 Blackfeet Indians, not more than 200 yards above him on the stream. It being still dark, Rose had not been seen. and he immediately started for camp, expecting to hear the howls of warriors on his trail. On reaching a hill near his own camp, he saw 2 Indians lying flat on the ground, reconnoitering. Rose felt certain he could kill one of them, but then what was to prevent the other from killing him? Just as he was considering what was best to be done, the Indians caught sight of him, and, springing to their feet, ran off at full speed, and Rose rode into camp with his old mule and beaver skins, thinking that he had made a very narrow escape. The rendezvous of 1837 was a very grand affair, and the new supply of stores was very much needed. The company had done a great deal of trading during the year, and their stock of goods had been nearly exhausted for some time. In fact, the trappers had not been in as bad a fix since their trip to the Humboldt River. Their blankets were worn out, and their ammunition was getting low. And Jim Bridger, legendary mountain man, began to get scared, as an encounter with the Blackfeet, under these circumstances, would have been dangerous. But the caravan from St. Louis made its appearance at about the usual time, and laughter, fun, and frolic were, once more, the order of the day. Several visitors came out with the train from St. Louis this year. Mr. Gray, the missionary, returned to the mountains, bringing with him his wife and 4 other ladies, all bound for the mission on the Columbia River. An English nobleman, known as Sir William Stewart, called by the trappers Captain Stewart, also came out with the train, bringing with him a retinue of servants and a number of splendid horses. This was Captain Stewart's second trip to the mountains, he having been delighted with his first visit. He brought with him lots of stores and regaled the whole of the trappers with a grand entertainment. He also made them some very valuable presents, giving Bridger, Kit Carson, and Joe Meek, with whom he had become acquainted on his first visit, each a valuable horse, and to many of the other trappers he also gave costly presents. It was at this entertainment that Rose partook of some water and crackers, this being the first thing of the kind he had eaten since his stay in the mountains, and the boys all thought it a great delicacy. The Delaware and Shawnee Indians came in large numbers to trade, and that summer Jim Bridger sent over 100 packs of beaver skins to St. Louis, together with a large quantity of buffalo robes and grizzly pelts. There was the usual amount of drinking, carousing, and horse racing, and altogether the rendezvous of this year presented a remarkably lively appearance. When the rendezvous was pretty well over, and the time for fall trapping was drawing near, Bridger called in Rose and Carson for the purpose of holding a powwow as to the route it would be best to take for the fall hunt. Rose was in favor of the Wind River, as beaver were known to be plentiful in all of the streams that took their rise in the Wind River Mountains. But to reach this desirable location, it would be necessary to pass through the heart of Blackfeet country, and, in all probability, they would have to do some tall fighting. But, as the idea of a fight with the Blackfoot was not likely to prove an objection to their taking that route, that, in fact, to many of the trappers it would be an inducement, it was agreed by Bridger and his partners that the Wind River should be the scene of operations for the first part of the fall hunt. All things now in readiness, Bridger and his company started for the Wind River Mountains, and nothing of interest occurred for the first 2 or 3 days. On the 4th day, however, Rose, Meek, and about 30 or 40 of the other trappers set out to travel up the river to the headwaters, accompanied by the famous Indian painter Stanley, whose party was met with, this fall, traveling among the mountains. The party of trappers were a day or 2 ahead of the main camp when they found themselves following close after a big Blackfeet village, which had recently passed over the trail, as could be seen by the usual signs. Also, by the dead bodies strewn along the trail, victims to that horrible scourge, smallpox. The village was evidently fleeing to the mountains, hoping to rid itself of the plague in their colder and more salubrious air. Not long after coming to these evidences of proximity to an enemy, a party of 150 of their warriors were discovered encamped in a defile or narrow bottom enclosed by high bluffs through which the trappers would have to pass. Seeing that in order to pass the war party and the village, which was about half a mile in advance, there would be some fighting to be done, the trappers resolved to begin the battle at once by attacking their enemies, who were as yet ignorant of their presence in the neighborhood. In pursuance of this determination, Rose, Meek, and a number of other trappers commenced hostilities. Leaving their horses in camp, they crawled along the edge of the overhanging bluff until opposite of the encampment of Blackfeet, then fired on them from the shelter of some bushes which grew along the rocks. But the Blackfeet, though ignorant of the number of enemies, were not to be dislodged so easily, and, after an hour or two of random shooting, contrived to scale the bluffs at a point higher up and to get upon a ridge of ground still higher than that occupied by the trappers. This movement dislodged the latter, and they hastily retreated through the bushes and returned to camp. The next day, the main camp having come up, the fight was renewed. While the greater body of the company with the pack horses were passing along the high bluffs overhanging them, the party of the day before, and 40 or 50 others, undertook to drive the Indians from the bottom, and by keeping them engaged, allow the train to pass in safely. This they contrived to do, and, after some heavy skirmishing, the Indians were compelled to retreat to their village, and Bridger and his company continued to the Wind River without meeting any further adventure. Chapter 29. The Fall Hunt. Ammunition runs short. Rose volunteers to go to Fort Laramie. Rose's adventures with the Gros Ventre, and his safe return. The fall hunt did not prove as successful as anticipated. Though beaver were plentiful on the Wind River, the company were continually annoyed by prowling bands of Blackfeet, who were hovering around the camp in hopes of cutting off some straggling trapper or stampeding and stealing some of the horses. This annoyance interfered considerably with the trappers' business, as they were compelled to hunt in strong squads. Even then, they would often lose some of their traps. This was not at all a healthy situation for the trappers to be placed in, but it was still more unhealthy for the Blackfeet, several of whom were caught sneaking around the camp and sent to the happy hunting grounds by the deadly rifle fire of the trappers. To add to their misfortune and annoyance, it was found that their ammunition was running short, and it would be impossible for them to continue on unless a fresh supply could be obtained from some quarter. In fact, Bridger began to get very uneasy, and towards the latter end of October, he sent Tom Briggs with 10 men and some pack horses to Fort Laramie to procure the needed supplies, and with strict orders to return with them at once before winter set in. But, unfortunately, cold and stormy weather came on early that winter, and before the middle of November, the company proceeded to their winter headquarters on the Yellowstone. By the latter end of November, the winter appeared to be set in earnest. There were continual and heavy storms, and all the streams in that region were frozen over. A small party of the trappers got lost, and had been given up for some time, as it would be impossible for horses to travel through the snow, and Bridger began to be very much alarmed at the safety of the company. Several consultations were held as to what was best to be done under the circumstances. Bridger thought the lost trappers had been gobbled up by the Indians, or they would most assuredly have been back before winter set in. At length, Rose volunteered to go to Fort Laramie if one of the other trappers would accompany him. But this, at first, none of them seemed inclined to do. But after 2 days' consideration, a trapper by the name of David Woods volunteered to go, and it was agreed that Rose and Woods should start the next morning. The accoutrements of their journey consisted, besides their rifles and ammunition, of a buffalo robe and a blanket for each, and a pair of snowshoes. Thus equipped, and provided with 2 days' ration of buffalo meat, they started on a perilous journey of 300 miles, through a wild and mountainous country covered with snow, which in some places was 50 or 60 feet deep, and knowing that at any time they were likely to fall in with a savage grizzly or the still more dangerous Blackfeet. with a farewell cheer from their comrades, and with, quote, health that mocks the doctor's rules, and knowledge never learned in schools, they commenced their first day's journey to Fort Laramie. The first night, they thought they had accomplished about 25 miles of their journey, and they camped near a small stream. They scooped a hole in the snow, and breaking off some pine bushes for a bed, they rolled themselves in their blankets and buffalo robes and slept soundly till morning. They found, however, that the travel of the day before had strained their insteps to such a degree that they could scarcely walk, and it was only after a great deal of rubbing that they were able to travel with their snowshoes. The second day, they did not make more than 10 miles before their feet gave out completely. They had reached the banks of a small river, comparatively free of snow, and had seated themselves on a log to rest, when a couple of deer came trotting down on the other side of the stream. Rose immediately took his rifle from its pouch and shot one of them. Then, gathering a lot of dry limbs, they built a fire and feasted sumptuously on the venison steak. Then, replenishing their fire, they laid down between it and the log they had set on, and slept comfortably until morning. In the morning, finding their insteps were too sore to travel, they rested another day. The next morning, being thoroughly rested, Rose proposed that they should put up some soft buffalo skin between the strap of the snowshoe and their insteps. This they found acted like a charm, and from that time forward they had no more trouble with their snowshoes. After about 2 weeks they struck the Sweetwater, and a few days after reached the North Platte, and, to their great joy, landed at Fort Laramie 2 days before Christmas. Here they found the lost party of trappers, who had arrived at the fort in safety, but, owing to the winter having set in so early, they were afraid to attempt to rejoin their company. Rose and his comrade Woods were hospitably received and entertained, and they were glad to get a few days of rest after their long and perilous journey. Christmas was celebrated at the fort in the usual manner. A cannon that was mounted in the bastion was heavily loaded to be shot off as a grand Christmas gun. In order to make a louder report, an old pair of buckskin pants and several pairs of old moccasins were rammed in till the gun was filled nearly to the muzzle. The gunner refused to touch the cannon off, as he said there was sure to be a burst. Dave Crow, one of the crappers and a particular friend of Rose's, took the iron rod from the fire and touched it off, and, as the gunner predicted, it flew into 100 pieces. One of the splinters broke Crow's leg. One of the men at the fort pretended to know all about dressing the wound, and Rose left his friend in his care. Rose was compelled to go up the Chugwater River with his horses, as the pasture was getting very poor around the fort. During his absence, his friend Crow died, the man caring for him having bandaged his legs so tightly that mortification set in. The trappers had a jolly time at the fort during winter. Rose says it was the most pleasant winter he spent during his stay in the mountains. While Rose was at the fort, Messalino, a Mexican trapper and scout who had been up at the Chugwater River, came in, bringing with him a vial that contained about an ounce of gold dust. The trappers, at first, laughed at the idea of its being gold, but the Mexican assured them that this was the pure stuff, and added that his father and himself had worked in a gold mine for years. When the spring set in, Rose and several other trappers started to join Jim Bridger's company, having with them about 15 pack horses and mules loaded with goods and supplies. They journeyed about a week without meeting any adventure worth relating, when one day, about noon, having ascended up a steep ridge, they came upon a band of about 50 Gros Ventre Indians. These Indians are not as fierce as the Blackfeet, but are very imprudent and overbearing when they think they have the upper hand. The Gros Ventres halted about 150 yards from the trappers, and the chief came forward to hold a powwow. And one of the trappers leading the party went out to meet him. The chief assumed a very dictatorial tone. He said his band was poor and needed supplies, and that if the white man would give up their horses and mules with their packs, he would allow the trappers to go on their way unharmed. If not, they must take the consequences. the trapper said he would return to his company and consult with his men. This he did, looking pretty badly scared. He told the trappers that he thought it was the best thing they could do, and that perhaps giving up their horses and goods would be the only chance to save their lives. This speech made Rose very angry. He represented to the other trappers that he and his comrade Wood had traveled 300 miles in the depth of winter to secure the much-needed supplies for their company, and that the very existence of the American Fur Company who employed them depended on these supplies reaching them. He pointed out that the Gros Ventres were not much more than 3 to 1, that they were very poorly armed, not having more than a dozen rifles among them, the balance of their arms being bows and arrows and spears, that he would make peaceable terms with them if possible, but that he would fight as long as he had a bullet in his pouch before they should take a single horse or pack. Most of the trappers coincided with the views expressed by Rose, and the chief again came out, accompanied by a half-breed as his interpreter, and Rose and Marcelino were appointed to meet with them and state their case. Rose told the chief that the white men had always been friendly to the Gros Ventres, and that they were willing and remained so, and that they were willing to make him some handsome presents. He stated that they were well armed, and before they would give up a single horse or pack, they would fight to the death. And, not to be beaten in bombast, Rose informed the chief that they had often whooped bands of Blackfeet when the odds were much greater against them. This speech acted like magic, and the chief and his interpreter returned to his band, quite crestfallen. Rose and his party then took the packs from the mules, and the barrels of 15 rifles were pointed at the Indians, who, seeing the white men determined, accepted a few butcher knives and a couple of red blankets, and the trappers went on their way. In a few days, they arrived at the Rosebud, where they met with Jim Bridger and his company. The delight on receiving the longed-looked-for supplies can be better imagined than described. South Dakota, June 1823. On the vast expanse of the undulating prairie that extends to the horizon in every direction, a contingent of mules, horses, and men moves warily alongside a river, with pensive eyes switching from the water to the surrounding landscape, searching for signs of danger. They are hundreds of miles from anything resembling a city, in territory that does not belong to them. They are a mix of men from a plethora of backgrounds and ethnicities, dressed in a menagerie of wool shirts, buckskin leggings, boots, moccasins, serapes, raccoon skin caps, and belts. Their common goal, put simply, is money, made by way of accumulating and selling beaver pelts, the coveted material that makes the popular top hats of the day worn throughout New York, Paris, and London. Their methods are simple. Set traps for the beavers, after which the animals will become ensnared in the traps and drown. Then, the trappers will return to collect the beaver pelts and repeat this process until the beaver population has been exhausted, before finally moving on. But, in this case, simple does not equal easy. Opposing them are the elements, from blazing heat to icy cold, from snow to dust storms, from droughts to flash flooding. Animal attacks, from the numerous grizzly bears which prowl the continent, to rattlesnakes, to buffalo stampedes, pose an ever-present threat. Hostile native tribes like the Blackfoot, Arikara, and Comanche have, already, in these early years of the fur trade, killed many trappers in gruesome ways for violating their tribal territorial bounds. Among this party of men are some who will go on to become legends in the annals of mountain man history. They are commanded by William H. Ashley and Major Andrew Henry, and among their ranks are Hugh Glass and Jedediah Smith, all men whose future exploits will become the stuff of mountain man legend. Smith is an anomaly amongst this already anomalous lot, as he is a devout Methodist, reads the Bible daily, and refrains from coarse language, as well as dalliances with unknown women and strong drink. On this day, he is approached by Major Henry and directed to ride south to Ashley's fort, aptly known as Fort Ashley. He is to inform Ashley that the company is in need of more horses, and that the Arikara tribe will likely be the closest people with which to trade in horseflesh. Jedediah Smith is still a relative neophyte to the world of trapping, but he is a man on the rise within the ranks of his company, as his reputation as a stalwart and trustworthy companion grows by the day. And so, Smith sets out to the south, and is fortuitously met by Ashley on the trail. The pair then proceed to the Arikara village, where they seek to buy more horses. The Arikara, a northern plains semi-agricultural tribe known both for their prowess in trade and warfare, whose ire had been stirred by some recent bad dealings with other white traders, are in a less than cordial mood. However, Ashley and his men have guns and ammunition that the Arikara know they can acquire through few, if any, other sources. Thus, there is a terse and tense peace, as often happens in these instances on the frontier. In the wilds of North America, native tribes and fur trappers are not necessarily antagonistic. In fact, sometimes the case can be quite the opposite. For centuries in colonial America and Canada, native tribes had been employed by large fur company magnates to supply them with the highly profitable furs of the deer, mink, otter, and beaver that had profligated their homeland. However, as game populations began to dwindle, the fur companies eventually brought their search for pelts to the expanses of the North American prairies and Rocky Mountains. The tribes who inhabited these lands oftentimes expressed little to no interest in working for fiat currency or goods when their lifestyles and economies were focused on hunting the immense herds of American bison that populated the plains. Thus, in the spirit of their predecessors in men like Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton, who were known as long hunters, the fur companies have scoured the outlying cities of the frontier, offering gainful employment to any man with the gumption and skills to venture onto the inhospitable frontier to procure the valuable fur of the innumerable beaver that inhabited the rivers and streams that crisscrossed the continent. Still, fur companies routinely employ native persons as translators, trackers, and trappers. Many of the early mountain men owe their skills to lessons learned from their native guides. Even in the 19th century, in the middle of the plains, no culture existed entirely in a vacuum. This could be seen not only in the dress of both native trappers and tribes, who often traded in various garbs such as jewelry made from beads from China, hats made in factories on the eastern seaboard, and buffalo robes harvested and carefully prepared in centuries-old fashion by native tribeswomen. While tools such as firearms indeed proved invaluable to the native tribes, so too did steel tools and implements such as axes, knives, and cooking utensils. Thus, a robust trade between the fur-trapping companies and the inhabiting tribes of the northern plains has been a mainstay for years, even in the 1820s. At the Arikara village, initial dealings are made between Smith, Ashley, and the Arikara. As the sun begins to set, it is mutually agreed that trading will continue the following day. Ashley splits his forces into two, leaving one on land to guard the supplies they had brought out from the boats, and the other to man the two boats which were anchored about 30 yards from the banks of the river. It is decided that Ashley will be in direct command of the boats, and Smith will be in charge of the force guarding the supplies. Now, nearly all of the mountain men present go about their nightly duty of making dinner, cleaning their weapons, checking their supplies, and preparing for the next day's travel and trading. But when all have finally bedded down for the night, two men from the mountain man's party sneak into the Arikara camp with whiskey and trinkets that they hope to trade for illicit relations with the Arikara women. This proves to be a fatal mistake. Just after midnight, Colonel Ashley is awakened by 3 Arikara warriors who have snuck onto the boat and are attempting to loot its cargo. He brandishes his pistol and chases them off the boat. But just as the Arikara make it to the shore, and the sound of sloshing water from their swim strokes goes quiet, it is suddenly replaced by the frantic screams of one of the 2 mountain men who have snuck into the Arikara camp. He and his companion had indeed found the Arikara women they were hoping to, but they had also found the Arikara men, who were not happy with the presence of intruders attempting to defile their wives, daughters, and sisters. His companion has been cut down where he was found. The surviving trapper, a man named Edward Rose, has escaped and now appears on the banks of the river, making his way, as fast as he can, for the trapper's camp on shore. As he runs, he screams that his partner in mischief, a man named Aaron Stevens, is dead, and the Arikara are now in a collectively angry mood. Still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness and alerted to both the attempted robbery of Ashley's boat and the killing of their comrade in the camp by the now enraged Arikara, the mountain men begin to hurriedly and vociferously debate their options. Some argue for immediately moving the horses they have, a sizable herd by this point, to the opposite shore before daybreak, so that they might be in a better position to flee when the sun does come up, with at least the river between them and the expected Arikara attack. Others argue for the retrieval of Stephen's body. As these debates carry on, a lone Arikara suddenly appears on the horizon above the riverbanks. Still in the dark, he calls out that he will try to broker a deal for the return of their comrade's body, for the price of one of their best horses. The mountain men agree to this, but a short time later, the enterprising Arikara returns to inform them that unfortunately he will not be able to uphold his end of the deal. Stevens's body has in fact been so badly mutilated that there is nothing left to return to them. This, understandably, sends a cold chill through the ranks of the shore party. It is decided that they will now have to move the horses as quickly as possible as the sunrise nears with every passing minute. Remaining calm and cool by all accounts, Jed Smith embraces his first real opportunity at leadership and calmly directs the movement of the horses across the river. However, as the sun begins to rise and a large number of horses and men are still mid-river or on the near bank waiting their turn, the mountain men are greeted with a horrifying sight. Silhouetted in the new morning sunlight are hundreds of Arikara warriors, tamping shot down into their muskets, nocking their arrows, and taking up offensive positions. The full gravity of the situation is now painfully apparent to everyone present. They are stuck, with the enemy having the high ground and no cover to be found. Within moments, musket balls, spears, and arrows begin to rain down on them from above. Dozens of horses and a number of trappers fall dead in the initial volley, with many others bravely wounded. The screams of the injured and dying men and horses fills the air, as Ashley and the men on the boats attempt to meet them on the other shore and make their getaway. The men on the boats provide what covering fire they can, and the men on shore take cover behind the bodies of the dead horses. From here, as chaos reigns all around, Jed Smith coolly and calmly doles out directions to those in his charge. As he and his men fire and reload, they simultaneously make strategic retreats, moving by leapfrogging from one defensive position to the next until reaching the comparative safety of the boats. Amidst all of this, Ashley's boat has run aground momentarily on a sandbar. The other boat, at around this same time, cuts ties to their anchor and begins moving downstream in an attempt to at least save themselves from this seemingly hopeless situation. Ashley's boat is quickly freed and makes its way as close to the shore as possible. Smith and his men finally reach the banks of the river, dive in, and begin to frantically swim. Some are hit by arrows and musket balls and sink under the surface, never to be seen again. Some are swept downriver beyond the extended oars and hands of their comrades, also never to be seen again. The lucky few who managed to make it onto the boats, including Jed Smith and Hugh Glass, now hunker down and return fire as the boats make their way as quickly as possible down the Missouri River and out of range of Arikara musket and arrow fire. For some of these men, this will be the end of their mountain man adventures. Those who decide they have had enough of this wild and dangerous life are put on boats back to St. Louis, along with their injured and recovering comrades. No one blames them for preferring the comforts of home to this lonely land where life is all too often short and seemingly cheap. But the careers of William Ashley, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith are far from over. One incident immediately following the battle speaks to the human cost of this attack that will be felt by families scattered all over the American states back east. Hugh Glass himself will go on to pen a heart-wrenching letter to the family of John Gardner, a mountain man who had been killed in the Arikara fight. The letter reads, "Dear Sir, my painful duty is to tell you of the death of your son, who befell at the hands of the Indians 2nd June in the early morning. He lived little while after he was shot and asked me to inform you of his sad fate. We brought him to the ship, where he soon died. Mr. Jedediah Smith, young man of our company, made a powerful prayer which moved all of us greatly, and I am persuaded that John died in peace. His body we buried with others near this camp and marked the graves with a log. His things we send to you. The savages are greatly treacherous. We traded with them as friends, but after great storm of rain and thunder, they came at us before light, and many were hurt. I myself was shot in the leg. Master Ashley is bound to stay in these parts till the traitors are rightly punished. Your obedient servant, Hugh Glass." This letter denotes not only Glass's deep sense of humanity, as well as his anger towards the Arikara, but it is the first mention of the piety and character of Jedediah Smith. Smith would mount an expedition along with an unnamed French-Canadian trader to a nearby fort in the hopes of mounting an even larger retributive force to supplement those that Ashley had already mustered. After this, he would carry on to travel perhaps more country than any other mountain man in history. But the many stories of the legendary exploits of Hugh Glass, William Ashley, and Jedediah Smith are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Montana, May 1810. At their campsite on the shores of the Jefferson River, a small group of fur trappers ready themselves for another long day's work of setting and checking their traps. These men are among the first to venture into this territory, a land whose unrivaled beauty is constantly at odds with the very real and very mortal threat of hostile tribes. The trappers' shared goal is to acquire their own personal fortunes by trapping the seemingly endless supply of beaver and selling the pelts to hat manufacturers back east. The mountain men are traders and trappers, not settlers, and they are not necessarily seen as intruders by all of the tribes. In fact, many have deep ties to the native peoples, often being adopted or marrying into the tribes, and several of the fur trappers in this group hail from mixed-race families, and they are not at all considered unusual. And perhaps none among this crew of fur trappers is as representative of the meeting and mixing of cultures as 36-year-old George Druillard. Born in 1773 in old Sandwich town, Windsor, Ontario, to a French-Canadian father and a Shawnee mother, Druillard has grown up on the frontier, learning the skills required of any good woodsman, from tracking to hunting and fishing to map-making. However, since his father was a commissioned officer in the military, the young man also learned to read, write, and speak both French and English, as well as a number of native dialects, including Shawnee and Iroquois. He is also fluent in the common sign language ubiquitous here amongst most tribes of the northern plains, and this makes him a valuable man. In 1803, he was recruited by Meriwether Lewis for what would become the legendary Voyage of Discovery, in which the party of Lewis and Clark made the first incursion into the high plains, then the Rockies, and ultimately to the Pacific coast and back. Druillard had solidified his place in frontier lore with his participation in this expedition, and now he is viewed by many of the younger trappers with a sense of awe. He claims that, being as he is half native, he is as at home in the wilderness as any native in the territory, and thus is in fact quite safe roaming about freely, anywhere that he pleases. However, even the rawest rookie trappers among them assume that Druillard means this, at least in part, as a joke, for all among them are painfully, palpably aware that they are still intruding on lands that they are not welcome in. Their mere presence here, uninvited and without permission, means that they are all subject to the dangers that this entails, including violent ends at the hands of tribes like the Cheyenne, the Arikara, and, most prevalent in this area, the mighty Blackfoot. The Blackfoot have long dominated here on the northern plains. They are a warrior society whose very existence hinges on their possession of the best available hunting grounds. For well over a century now, they have proven nearly universally combative to all trespassers, and there's no reason to think that they have changed their tact. However, these dangers have been assumed by all in the party before they had even moved their expedition out from St. Louis in the first place. On that brisk morning, as the men gnawed down quick, cold breakfasts of beef jerky and pemmican, they had all decided that the danger of life as a trapper was, in the end, worth the risk. Because though there is plenty of danger to be had out here on the frontier, there is also plenty of money to be made. But the assumed risk of their job does not mean that they are foolhardy men. Every morning begins with the men getting approval for their proposed territory from the officer in charge, and then checking out the necessary gear from their quartermaster, all of which has to be meticulously recorded and later scoured over by accountants from the fur companies that they work for. The day usually begins before dawn, with the men departing camps in groups of 4. Each group then works their way up and down the tributaries of whatever major river that they are on, with 2 of them setting traps and the other 2 keeping a watch out for hostile native warriors. In general, this system does seem to provide enough security to keep the vast majority of the trappers alive. However, it does not often make them wealthy. This meticulous approach means that the profit from every pelt has to be split 4 ways, in addition to the fur companies taking their share. Thus, while their physical security is most assuredly greatly appreciated, many find the practice financially draining and more than a little frustrating. Among the most disgruntled of the men is George Druillard. With all of his knowledge and experience and what he believes to be the inherent invincibility provided by his bloodline, Druillard believes this diligent practice is not only unnecessary, but an affront to his personal honor. Druillard objects so strongly, in fact, that he has begun to operate in open defiance of the company's policies. For several days prior to this, he had simply finished his breakfast, mounted his horse, and deftly slipped off over the hills, alone but for his single-shot rifle, his pistol, and his tomahawk. To the rest of the fur trappers, the luster of his reputation has now worn thin. He now seems to be a man lost in his own legend and bent on inviting his own destruction. The more experienced among them who have been so unlucky as to find the mutilated bodies of their comrades believe Druillard has gone insane. Again and again, the veterans among them have beseeched Druillard, as he headed out for the day, not to go out alone. But, much to their dismay, Druillard has repeatedly not only gone out alone, but returned each day with a sizable harvest of beaver. And, because Druillard has gotten these pelts on his own, he will be entitled to all of the profits that they will draw. Other than the fur company's cut, Druillard will be pocketing all of the profit from each pelt, as opposed to the 25% that the rest of his cohorts are used to. In very short order, Druillard has decided that giving up this level of profit increase for a measure of security is at once a wholly unacceptable proposition. And so, on this day, as his cohorts begin to make their way up and downstream to begin their day's labor, George Druillard again bids them a jovial farewell and heads off over the hills alone. The day passes by like any other, with some men finding their traps full and others returning to camp empty-handed. But that evening, as the men sit around their small campfire, a pensive mood begins to hang in the air. As each four-man group makes their way back into camp, word goes around that something has gone wrong. No one has seen or heard from George Druillard all day. But nothing can be done in the dead of night, and so the men sleep as best they can before waking to another chilly riverside morning, still with no Druillard in sight. Growing more and more nervous, the men discuss how they might find and help the vaunted mountain man. In short order, a search party is sent out to comb the surrounding area, and it is only a matter of hours before the search party returns, eyes wide, faces somber, and with horrifying news to report. They have indeed found George Druillard. He had been caught alone near a small creek by a group of Blackfoot. How many, they cannot be sure, but from the number of arrows left at the scene, they assumed that there were several. To the best of the rescue party's estimation, Druillard had mounted his horse and ridden in small, feverish circles, firing off his rifle and then his pistol as he whirled. He had fought with his knife and tomahawk, and from the amount of blood on the egress trail of the Blackfoot, he had grievously wounded at least a few of them. However, his horse was ultimately shot, and Druillard was brought to the ground and drilled with arrows and lances. One can only imagine his regret after having been so assured of his safety. Once he was dead, or perhaps as he died, as was often the case in plains warfare, Druillard was eviscerated. He then had his hands and feet cut off and was ultimately beheaded. His head was never found. Terrified at both the ghastly sight before them and the very real prospect of the same thing happening to them, the search party hurriedly buried the frontiersman in a shallow grave before making their way back to camp. The death of George Druillard is a pivotal point in the history of the American mountain man. It illustrated that even the most experienced and venerable amongst them were as vulnerable to the hand of fate as any man. From here on out, few mountain men would ever venture out alone again. But though the story of George Druillard does end here, the story of the mountain men and the tribes that they interacted with, both peaceably and otherwise, is replete with countless stories such as this one. However, for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Sitka, Alaska, 1804. Dawn breaks cold and wet over Sitka Sound. The wind smells of spruce and sea salt. A heavy mist rolls off the ocean, clinging to the thick woods that line the shore. Outside a ceremonial plank house deep in the forest, dozens of Tlingit warriors wait, silent and still as stone. Inside, the clan elders confer. At the center of the gathering stands Chief Katlian of the Kiksadi. His face is painted black. Across his chest is a shirt of Chinese silk, layered over armored plates pounded from copper. Katlian is not merely a warrior. He is a symbol. Born into the Kiksadi clan of the Tlingit people, he rose in a time when foreign powers pressed harder each season against the ancient rhythms of life along the Alaskan coast. The son of a noble line within the Raven moiety, Katlian came of age navigating the intricate duties of clan politics, ceremonial obligations, and warfare, all in a world now teetering on the edge of colonization. By the late 1700s, as Russian fur traders encroached deeper into Tlingit territory, Katlian quickly earned a reputation not just for bravery, but for vision. He understood that the Russians brought more than guns and religion. They brought systems of ownership alien to Tlingit law. They sought to seize land, control trade, and undermine the sovereign kinship networks that had governed the clans for centuries. When the Russians built Redoubt St. Archangel Michael in 1799 on Tlingit hunting grounds without permission, it was Katlion who emerged as one of the foremost voices of resistance. Though he had once engaged in trade with Russian agents, ever the pragmatist, he would later help lead the assault that destroyed their fort in 1802, reclaiming the territory and warning the invaders that this land would not be taken easily. That act cemented his name. To the Russians, he was now a dangerous war chief. To his people, he was a leader and a warrior. And now, he is once again at the forefront of the Tlingits' fight. Long before European ships first arrived, the Tlingit had lived along this rugged coastline for generations beyond counting. Their society is rich, hierarchical, and complex, built on lineage, clan identity, trade, and territory. Each clan, such as the Raven and Eagle moieties, is part of an intricate web of alliances and obligations. Their homes are great plank houses carved from cedar. Their stories are passed down in carved totems, in woven robes, and in rhythmic songs carried by drums. They are not a scattered band of foragers, as the Russians believe. They are a confederation of warriors, traders, and diplomats with established laws and fierce loyalty to their lands. Sitka, called Shitka by the Tlingit, is not just a village. It is sacred ground. The forest, the sea, the salmon streams, and the mountain mists, they are not resources. They are ancestors, spirits, guardians, and they are not for sale. The council has made its decision. The Tlingit will not flee. They will not abandon their ancestral land. They will fight to the last man if they must. Already, the new fort that they have built inland, Shiskanao, or Fort of Young Saplings, has been stocked with muskets, black powder, and food stores. Within days of the Tlingits' council, the Russians appear again. Tall ships under foreign flags. The Russian-American Company's fleet, led by Alexander Baranov, has returned. After the Tlingit burned down the old Russian fort 2 years earlier, Baranov, as expected, has come back for revenge, with warships, mercenaries, and Aleut allies at his side. Baranov holds tremendous power and tremendous responsibility. But he was not born into power, nor was he trained for conquest. Alexander Andreevich Baranov came into the world in 1746, in the bustling merchant town of Kargopol, nestled deep in the forests of northern Russia. His father was a modest tradesman, his early education rudimentary. But in a century where empires expanded by sea, and wealth flowed not only through palaces, but through ledgers, Baranov found his footing not with sword or scepter, but with account books, ambition, and audacity. In his youth, Baranov moved to St. Petersburg, the empire's glittering gateway to the west. There, he labored for years as a clerk in merchant offices, absorbing the intricacies of trade, credit, shipping, and profit. He married, raised a family, and carved out a comfortable life. Yet, it was not enough. He wanted more. More independence, more reach, and more opportunity. And for Russian merchants at the close of the 18th century, that meant one thing: Alaska. In 1790, at the age of 44, Baranov took a bold gamble. He accepted a post in the farthest corner of the Russian realm, as chief manager for the Shelikov-Golikov Company, a private enterprise harvesting the riches of the Pacific coast. The company was already entrenched in the brutal fur trade across Siberia and the Aleutians. Its goal was simple: extract sea otter pelts by any means necessary, then ship them to China, where they sold for a small fortune. Baranoff was to expand operations, increase profit, and bring stability to a chaotic frontier. It would become his life's work. The journey to Alaska took over a year. Baranoff traveled by land across Siberia, through Kamchatka, and by ship across storm-tossed seas. When he finally arrived in Kodiak, he found a wild, lawless coast racked by conflict. The indigenous Alutiiq and Aleut peoples had been enslaved or conscripted by earlier traders, and revolts were frequent. Supplies were scarce, and weather could destroy a year's fortune in an afternoon. Baranoff, a merchant at heart, found himself at the edge of empire and the brink of survival. Yet, he thrived. In a land of hunger, he built storehouses. Where there was violence, he imposed order, often with cruelty. He also constructed schools and Orthodox churches. He established barter networks with native groups and forced hunting quotas onto entire villages. He negotiated with Spanish colonies in California and American traders from Boston. He took a native Alutiiq woman as his second wife and raised children with her. He kept the company alive through famines, through uprisings, and shipwrecks. Within only a few years, Baranoff had transformed the enterprise from a tenuous outpost into the backbone of Russia's North American holdings. When Tsar Paul I rechartered the company in 1799 as the Russian-American Company, it was granted monopoly rights and imperial sanction. The firm became a de facto government, and Baranoff, though never noble, never titled, became its unchallenged overlord. From his base in Kodiak, he ruled a territory larger than Europe. His word was law from the Bering Sea to the Pacific Northwest. But Baranoff had a flaw. He knew the fur trade depended on conquest, and conquest demanded expansion. By 1799, he had pushed into Tlingit territory in southeastern Alaska, a land rich in salmon, timber, and otter pelts. And it was that year, without permission, that he had ordered the construction of Redoubt St. Archangel Michael. The move enraged the local Kiksadi clan, but Baranoff was unmoved. However, Baranoff had underestimated them, and he had paid the price. In 1802, the Tlingit warriors had destroyed the fort, killed the garrison, and reclaimed their land. It was a humiliating blow, one that tarnished his image back in St. Petersburg. For Baranoff, the defeat at Sitka was personal. It threatened not just the company's future, but his own authority. He had spent the next 2 years rallying resources, petitioning the imperial court, ordering supplies, conscripting Aleut hunters, and recruiting ships. Now, in 1804, at nearly 60 years old, he leads a military expedition back to Sitka to crush the Tlingit resistance once and for all. The 22-gun frigate Neva, a veteran of global voyages, is placed under Captain Yuri Lysansky, a man with experience but little taste for frontier war. Baranoff also gathered hundreds of fighting men, Russians, Siberian Cossacks, and dozens of Aleut hunters conscripted from earlier campaigns. They brought with them muskets, cannons, iron tools, and Orthodox priests. But what Baranoff truly hopes to bring is permanence. The redoubt he lost in 1802 was, in the end, merely a trading post. The one he now intends to build, New Archangel, will be a capital, a city of the empire. This time, the Russians will not merely occupy Sitka. They will plant a flag meant to last forever. As the ships move into the bay, Katlian's warriors move up the shoreline, paddling their traditional war canoes, moving like shadows across the water. They paddle silently through hidden channels and kelp beds, their strokes timed perfectly with the splash of the waves. Each canoe carries warriors armed with flintlock muskets, clubs, and carved knives. Many wear helmets shaped like raven beaks or wolf heads. Baranov lands his forces near the ruins of the old redoubt St. Archangel Michael. He expects resistance, but not the full force of the Tlingits. His men unload cannon and dig shallow trenches, preparing to rebuild the fort atop the ashes. As the Russians are engrossed in this task, the Tlingit scouts signal from the ridges, using flashes of light bounced from copper mirrors and bird call whistles. Kotlian himself now watches on from a rocky overlook, hidden from the Russians' view. He feels assured that victory is at hand. The Tlingit know their land. They know the tides and the forests, the rhythms of elk and eagles, and they know that this battle is not the beginning of a conflict, but the boiling point of a war already decades in motion. As the Russians work, the warriors now creep into position for an attack. Meanwhile, farther back in the woods, also hidden from the Russians' view, the Tlingits' own fortress rises like a wooden beast from the forest floor. Behind its wooden palisade walls, men prepare for siege, melting lead for musket balls, stuffing powder into horns, and sharpening blades. Suddenly, the rain stops, and the mist clears. A raven cries overhead. With their surroundings now more visible, the Russians see the maneuvering Tlingit warriors. In a hurried response, the Russians rapidly assemble their forces and open fire upon the Tlingit. The first volley cracks through the forest like thunder. In their response, the Tlingit marksmen open fire from concealed ridges. Some of Baranov's men stumble. Some collapse instantly, and others scramble behind felled logs. Smoke hangs low as musket flashes ignite in every direction, and the Russians now realize that they have walked straight into a trap. Suddenly, with a mighty war cry, Kotlian himself charges from the brush. His hammer, a battle trophy taken from the 1802 battle, is in his hand, and his face is twisted in a fury. Dozens follow him, erupting from the forest in a wave of noise and color. The Russians now fall back in confusion. Their Aleut allies hesitate, caught between fear and obligation. This is not the organized resistance they had expected. This is a bloody, chaotic fight. Baranov orders his cannon to fire into the trees. The blasts rip through branches and bodies alike. Some Tlingit fall, but others press even closer, too near for the artillery to angle downwards. Fighting turns into chaos. Bayonets meet clubs, sabers clash, and screams echo through the fog. Baranov is wounded, struck in the face by a club. His men begin to retreat down the beach, carrying their dead and wounded comrades. The Tlingit, for their part, do not pursue far. They fall back into the woods, satisfied for now. The first day has ended in blood and confusion. As night falls, the Tlingit retreat back to their fort and hold their ground. From inside the sapling fort, they tend to their wounded and prepare for the next assault. Fires burn low behind the palisade walls, and in the distance, the sound of Russian axes and hammers returns. Baranov's men are working through the night. 2 days pass. The Russians complete the framing of their new fort, calling it New Archangel. The injured Baranov cedes command to Naval Captain Yuri Lysyansky, whose ship, the Neva, sits anchored just offshore. The Tlingit watch from their fort, waiting for the next move. On October 4th, the Russian warship opens fire upon them. For hours, its cannons roar, launching volley after volley into the forest. Trees fall, and smoke blankets the mountainside. Inside the fort, Tlingit warriors hold their positions, unable to attack or maneuver under the barrage. Cannonballs breach the outer wall, splinters fly, and warriors rush to repair the damage with fresh logs and animal hides. Despite the dire nature of their circumstances, though, still the Tlingit hold on. For the following several days, the Neva bombards the fort. but the Tlingit refuse to break. Still, among their ranks, tensions are growing. Food is running low. Water is becoming scarce. The warriors' resolve remains unbroken, but elders warn that if the siege drags on, survival may become impossible. Katlian listens. He understands now what must be done. On October 8th, as the fog thickens, the Tlingit now slip away. Silently, they move through the mist. They vanish into the land, retreating north to regroup and survive. When the Russian troops storm the fort the very next morning, they find nothing but silence. The walls still stand. The fire pits are cold. A copper helmet lies in the dirt, but the Tlingit are gone. Baranov, now recovered enough to resume command, orders the Russian flag to be raised over the ruins. Sitka is declared a possession of the Russian Empire. A Russian Orthodox priest offers a blessing, but the victory feels hollow. The price in blood has been high, and the land, aside from the small redoubt they have just carved out, still, for all intents and purposes, belongs to the Tlingit. As the Russian flag flies on the coast, Katlian stands before a fire at the Tlingit's camp miles away, mourning his dead and preparing his people for the long winter ahead. For both the Russians and the Tlingit alike, the future is now very uncertain. The very next morning, Baranov's men resume work on their fort. Trees are felled, earth is moved. Timber barracks soon rise beside a stockade of sharpened logs. Cannons are mounted facing the harbor. Warehouses are erected to store fur pelts, flour, and black powder. Baranov declares the region pacified and sends word back to St. Petersburg that Sitka has been retaken and secured. Russian settlers soon follow. Company agents, shipwrights, traders, and clerks. More Orthodox churches are built, and a governor's house is established on a nearby rise overlooking the bay. Aleut laborers, many brought involuntarily, are put to work harvesting furs and assisting with construction. At an initial glance, it seems Baranov has accomplished his goal. But beneath the surface, there is unease. The forest never feels entirely silent. At night, fires flicker in the far hills. Canoes are often spotted on distant shores. The Tlingit are seemingly gone, but obviously not defeated. And every man within the walls of New Archangel knows this land is not truly theirs. It is borrowed, held in tension, and bought in blood. The Battle of Sitka would be the last major armed conflict between Russian forces and the Tlingit, though smaller attacks and firefights would continue for years. For his part, Alexander Baranov will go on to be awarded the Order of St. Anna, second class, from the Russian government in 1807, in recognition of his services to his country. He would establish Fort Ross in California in 1812, and pursue a failed trading venture in Hawaii in 1815. He would eventually pass away in March of 1819 in the Dutch East Indies after becoming ill during a return trip to St. Petersburg. The ultimate fate of Katlian, the mighty Tlingit chief, is unknown, but his legacy lives on strong amongst his people even to this day. He stands as a symbol of Tlingit strength, resilience, and courage. But the innumerable stories of his people's bravery, as well as the stories of conquest and warfare in the history of Russia and Alaska, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. Also, be sure to follow us on TikTok and Instagram and subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.